Chapter 8. Mary. Mary followed Elizabeth up to the small house, her nerves bunching in her stomach. What if these women could tell she'd worked in a saloon? Would they treat her like the women in Chicago had? And how would they treat Elizabeth? "Everything okay?" Elizabeth asked. Mary nodded, determined to keep her fears to herself. Elizabeth was being so nice that she didn't want to make her feel bad. "I'm just nervous. I'm not sure what to do." Elizabeth offered a soft smile. "You just leave that to me." She lifted her hand and knocked on the door. The door opened, and a young woman with a baby on her hip and 2 toddlers at her feet stared back at them. "Hello, Mrs. Crosby. We're here about your dress order," Elizabeth said. "This is my assistant, Mary Lockwood." The woman's eyes grazed briefly over Mary before returning to Elizabeth. "Oh, thank goodness. I need a new dress, but as you can see, getting time to sew is a bit of a struggle around here." She stepped back and opened the door wider. "Please come in, but pardon the mess. I was just about to clean up for the 3rd time today." "Don't worry about the mess," Elizabeth said, stepping over a toy on the floor. "How many children do you have?" "5. The 2 older ones are at school. The twins here are 2, and this little one is just 4 months old." "You definitely have your hands full," Elizabeth said. "I do indeed. I can sew, but I haven't had any time to do it. This is my last dress without holes. I don't have much money, but I was hoping I could pay you with canned goods. Canning is the only thing I can do with the children underfoot." Elizabeth hesitated, and Mary could see a vein working in her neck. "Well, I do have rent to cover, but if you can do half in cash, I'll take the other half in canned goods." The woman pressed her lips together, her forehead furrowing in thought. Finally, she nodded. "I can do that." "Wonderful. Let's get your measurements, and Mary will show you some samples of fabric to choose from. If we don't have one you like, you can tell me what you would like, and I'll see if Mr. Brown can order it." Mrs. Crosby nodded again, and then held the baby out to a confused Mary. "You'll have to hold Betsy for a minute while I get measured." "But I've never held a baby before," Mary protested as she took a step back. "What if I drop her?" "It's not that hard," Mrs. Crosby said, placing the baby in Mary's arms and then adjusting her hold. "There, you see?" Mary stared down at the child in her arms. She was so small and yet perfect. An invisible band squeezed around Mary's heart. She was too old to ever have a child of her own. She knew that. But as she stared down at the tiny human in her arms, the desire to be a mother welled within her. This wasn't good. Her life already lacked so much. There was no room for more regrets. Lifting her eyes from the baby, she tried to focus on what Elizabeth was doing instead. And as soon as the measurements were complete, she handed the baby back to Mrs. Crosby and grabbed the fabric swatches. "Do you see one you like?" she asked, keeping her gaze from straying to the baby. Mrs. Crosby shifted the baby to the other arm so she could look closer. "This one's nice," she said, pointing to a blue checkered fabric. "Would this work on a dress, Elizabeth?" Elizabeth looked at the fabric and then eyed the woman as if imagining the dress on her. "This will be lovely, Mrs. Crosby, and I think the blue will really bring out your eyes." Pink bloomed on the woman's cheeks like the sun peeking up over the landscape in the morning. But before she could say anything, a crashing sound filled the air. Her eyes shot to the kitchen area, and she sighed. "It appears it's time for cleanup number 4. Is there anything else you need from me?" "No, I've got everything I need," Elizabeth said. "I'll let you know when it's done." "Thank you," Mrs. Crosby said, before hurrying off to the kitchen. Elizabeth motioned for Mary to follow her and led the way out of the house. "You did great," she said when they reached the wagon. Mary chuffed and shook her head. "No, you did great. You're a natural with people. I just stood there like a bump on a log." Elizabeth offered a small smile. "You'll get there. It was your first day, and you don't know these people. Once you do, I promise you'll find it easier." Mary wasn't sure about that, but she didn't feel the need to share her concerns with Elizabeth. "Okay, Mrs. Thompson is next," Elizabeth said, a soft sigh in her voice. "What's wrong?" Mary asked as the wagon moved forward. "Nothing. It's just that Mrs. Thompson is—" She hesitated, and Mary could tell she was searching for the right, kind word. "Mrs. Thompson is very opinionated, and she's not afraid to tell everyone how she feels. So don't worry about anything she says to you." But that's all Mary could do now. "Maybe I shouldn't go in with you. What if she sees me and knows that I don't belong? I don't want my past to ruin your future." Elizabeth shook her head and let go of the reins to squeeze Mary's hand briefly. "Nonsense. If she has a problem with you, then I don't need her as a client. You're my friend, and nothing is more important than that." Tears welled in Mary's eyes at the kind sentiment, but she couldn't help wondering if Elizabeth would feel the same way if it really did begin to affect her business. The Thompson house was just past the edge of town, but it was the grandest house Mary had seen here. It rivaled some of the houses in Chicago with its tall marble columns and green shutters. "They must be very rich," Mary said softly, as Elizabeth pulled the horse to a stop. "They are. I believe they came from money back east as well, but Mr. Thompson owns the bank and therefore has a lot of money. Unfortunately, he isn't the nicest man." "And Mrs. Thompson? Does she work?" A very unladylike snort escaped Elizabeth's lips. "Only if you consider bossing her servants around work. Evidently, she came over from Boston a few years ago after her parents passed. It was a mail-order bride situation from what I understand. But I don't think either of them ever really fell in love, and she refuses to give up her way of life." Mary's heart sank. A proper woman from Boston? She was bound to see Mary for who she really was then. "At least she'll probably pay in cash," Elizabeth said, as she led the way up to the front door. The porch appeared to wrap around most of the house and was painted as white as the rest of the house. "I won't be able to afford rent and your salary if everyone pays in canned goods." Mary stared at the columns as she passed them. She'd never seen marble columns up close, and she longed to touch them, but she didn't. Instead, she turned to her friend, a look of remorse on her features. "I'm sorry I'm burdening you." "You're no burden. I'm happy to have you here." Elizabeth knocked and the door opened, but the woman on the other side didn't look at all like Mary pictured. She was meek and small, and her eyes barely met Elizabeth's before skittering away like a scared animal. "Is Mrs. Thompson home?" Elizabeth asked. "We're here about her dress order." "Yes, ma'am," the girl said, issuing a small curtsy. "Come into the parlor and I'll get her." Of course, this girl was the maid, not the woman of the house. Mary should have known, but she was too worried about her own appearance to be thinking straight. Her eyes widened as she followed Elizabeth into the parlor. The house was more elegant than anything she'd seen, even in Chicago. "You may sit here while I fetch her," the girl said, pointing to a small sofa. "And I'll bring tea and cookies." "Oh, there's no need for that," Elizabeth said, waving her hand. "This isn't a social call, it's business." The girl's eyes widened. "Oh, but I must. Surely you won't object." "No, we don't object," Elizabeth said, her voice softer than before. "But it isn't necessary." The girl didn't look convinced, but she nodded before scurrying away. With a sigh, Elizabeth turned to Mary. "Go ahead and lay out our best fabrics. Hopefully we'll have one she'll like." Mary nodded and began pulling out the fancier and softer fabrics. "Ah, Elizabeth, I wondered when you would return." Mary looked up to see a tall woman descending the staircase. Her hair was piled on her head in an elaborate do, and her dress looked like it belonged at a ball rather than an everyday wear around the house. There was a large bustle in the back, and one on each side, creating a cascading effect. The neckline dipped daringly low, but a white lace filled the open area and extended down the front like a snowy waterfall. "I would have asked Harold, but you know how he and Mr. Brown get along." Her nose wrinkled in distaste. "I do hope one day you'll have a solo shop away from his mercantile. I don't know how long Harold will allow me to do business with you while you're in his store." She emphasized the word his. "I didn't know of any issue between Mr. Brown and your husband," Elizabeth said, "but I assure you that it is my hope to have my own space one day." "Oh, well, I'm surprised you hadn't heard, especially since you've been working with him the last few months, but they have an age-old beef. Evidently, Henry Brown stole the woman my Harold was supposed to marry when they were younger, and never apologized for it. A wicked thing to do, wouldn't you say? Of course, I guess it worked out for me in the end." Mary's mouth parted, but she caught herself before it fell completely open. She didn't know Mr. Brown well, but she couldn't believe he would steal another man's bride. "I don't know anything about it," Elizabeth said, "but Mr. Brown has been very kind to me." Her tone indicated she was speaking on the subject no longer. A look of shock crossed Mrs. Thompson's face before she brushed it away. "Well, I'm sure he has, but I'm not sure I could be around a man like that all day. To each her own, I suppose." Her words stated that she didn't care, but her tone said something entirely different. "Indeed," Elizabeth said quickly, ignoring the woman's baiting. "Now, I hear you need a dress. What kind of dress are you looking for?" "Well, I need several. Harold is planning on hosting a party for the railroad men and their wives, so I'll need one for that. Also, I heard that a group of suffragettes are coming through, and I'll be having them over for tea at the very least, so I'll need a dress for that." She paused and tapped a finger against her chin. "I know there's something else, but it's slipping my mind at the moment. I'm sure it will come to me, though, so let's begin with 3 dresses. 3 dresses? Mary had more than 3 dresses to her name, of course, but she'd never purchased 3 at a time, nor did she see the need for a different dress for each occasion. However, she was pleased for Elizabeth. Surely this order would help her out tremendously. "Wonderful," Elizabeth said. "Are you looking for something similar to what you're wearing, or would you like to look at some sketches?" "Actually, I have some pictures. Beth, please bring me my book," Mrs. Thompson called out. The meek girl popped her head into the room long enough to nod and then scurried out again. Mary wondered why the woman hadn't simply brought the book in with her, but then Elizabeth's words about Mrs. Thompson's need for bossing her servants around replayed in her head. Mary felt sorry for the girl, but at least Mrs. Thompson didn't seem violent like Luther or Jacob had been. Beth reappeared with a thick book in her hands and handed it to Mrs. Thompson. With barely a thank you, Mrs. Thompson took the book, dismissed poor Beth, and then turned back to Elizabeth. She flipped through the pages until she found what she was looking for. "I'm thinking one like this for Harold's thing." She turned the page. "One like this for tea." Another few pages flipped. "And one like this for whatever the third thing is." Elizabeth carefully flipped back and forth between the pages. Yes, I believe I can do these. Do you want to pick a fabric with Mary while I sketch them out for myself? Mrs. Thompson nodded and then approached Mary, her critical eye briefly glancing at Mary before scanning the offerings. We have a lovely taffeta and chiffon, Mary said, only stumbling a little over her words. Or I'm sure Mr. Brown can order a nice silk. Mrs. Thompson fingered the fabrics, a slight look of disdain on her face. I suppose these will have to do. I'd like one in a burgundy taffeta, one in green and one in blue. Sapphire, not baby blue. Yes, ma'am. Mary picked up the rest of the fabrics while Elizabeth finished her sketches. When she was done, Elizabeth bade Mrs. Thompson farewell, and the women returned to the wagon. Mary breathed a sigh of relief she hadn't realized she'd been holding. I told you she was something, didn't I? Elizabeth asked, with a mischievous smile as they climbed into the wagon. That you did, but I don't think anything you said could have prepared me, Mary said. Elizabeth laughed. That is true. I was hoping to take you to more of the homes, but we need to get this order placed with Mr. Brown right away. I'd hate to keep Mrs. Thompson waiting any longer than necessary. Do you think you can do that and stay at the store until I return? I think so, yes. Elizabeth nodded and urged the horses back to town. If anyone comes in, simply take their name and measurements and have them pick out a fabric. I can do the rest. Mary nodded, though she still didn't feel entirely prepared. She believed she could handle those tasks.